Kathrada Foundation, the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, and the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy. So this year, the network has called on people to unite against racism by educating themselves and others about the scourge, by mobilizing their organizations in their workplaces, communities, and organizing against racism, and by taking action against racism and not remaining silent when it occurs. This means, for example, taking up matters of racism through South African Human Rights Commission or the Equality Court, exposing it on social media, or reporting it via Zimele Racism Reporting App. So racism is a particularly important topic today. Its resurgence poses a threat to peace and stability across the world. So that's the context in which we are having this conversation tonight, and the conversation more about the rise of right-wing racism in the globe, in particular South Africa, and what it means for us as South Africans, particularly as a society that comes out of institutionalized racism and apartheid, as it were. So today we're going to be involved in a conversation that really takes us deeper into this issue. So we're going to probe more. What I would expect from everybody is debate, respect for each other's views without undermining the authenticity of the views themselves. So it's very important that we have that context. We're going to have 3 speakers or panelists, people who are going to give us a sense of, through their writings, as well as their experiences as social activists, as writers, social commentators, as also journalists, and people who are involved in the comedy. I think it's comedy. I don't know.
Some think it's comedy.
Yeah, some think it's comedy. I don't know. But so that the discussion is going to be more around that. Now, let me just introduce quite a few. But before I do that, we have a message from the Rabbi Said Sheikh, and Sahara, yes, from the Beit Emmanuel Progressive Jewish Community. He was supposed to be here, but could not be here. But he's written a letter to us, which I have a privilege to read for all of us. It reads as follows: Dear Zakira, kindly convey my warm greetings of comradeship to the participants of the event tonight, viewing it at the rise of right-wing racism globally and its links to South Africa. The reason I'm not with you this evening is the celebration of the Purim festival. It is a jolly festival characterized by dressing up, sharing sweets and drinks, but the story in its heart, the Easter or the Esther scroll, that is at the heart of the story. And that story is a harsh one, telling us about a plot back in the ancient Persian Empire days for killing all Jews. This story dated to the times of King Xerxes at the middle of the 5th century before the Common Era. Is for us early evidence to the existence of hate to the other, who may be different in culture, faith, or ethnicity. Sadly, the rhetoric and the methods haven't changed much since these early days. Back then, as in today, there are those who wish to destroy the rich texture of our diversity. What we see as a blessing is to them a curse. In that manner, we sense that the terrorist mass shootings at the Al-Nur Mosque and the Lilwood Islamic Center in Christchurch, New Zealand, last week are connected to the mass shooting at the Tree of Life congregation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, last October. They are connected not because those who did it were in contact. They weren't. They are connected because they are led by the same ideology, born of fear and hate, calling for separation and discrimination. Those are the powers of yesterday's orders. They sense that the world has changed. They sense the solid alliances between us. They sense the strength we have as we come together to defend democracy, peace, and human rights. They sense it and they are afraid. It is their fear who makes them dangerous. To this one should add the irresponsible leadership who is built out of spreading hate and deepening the divisions. This is our current conditions. We will continue to reach out to one another in our ongoing mission to build a mature and open society. Again and again, we shall repeat those basic truths. We are all the children of the Almighty. All of us should inherit dignity. All of us are entitled to share the abundance of the land. May all our deeds be for the sake of heaven, in friendship. Rabbi Sharif. Thank you. Okay, let me then just introduce our speakers here. The first one is Miriam Than, which I'm sure all of us know her very well. Is an author and a journalist who is currently part of the Maverick, Daily Maverick. The second speaker is Danielle Friedman. He's a journalist, a columnist, editor, but is best known as his alter ego, musical comedian Deep Fried Man. As a comedian, he has won awards and been a staple on the South African live comedy circuit as well as on television. Late Night News with Loyiso Gola, LOA on Mzansi Magic, and several Comedy Central specials. And in films, Material, Mrs. Right Guy. As a journalist, he has written for the Mail and Guardian, the Daily Maverick, the Sunday Times, Business Days, Wanted Magazine, and more. He's currently digital news editor at The Citizen. The third one is Nombuvuyo Linda. Nombuvuyo Linda is currently reading for her master's at the University of Wits in political science and works as a research associate at the annual Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, ASRI. Her previous work experience includes working as a researcher at the Wits Center for Diversity Studies, Thabo Mbeki Foundation Youth Hub, and the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, demonstrating her deep commitment to human rights, intercultural dialogue, and democratic citizenship. She's spoken as a panelist, particularly I think it was here, when we launched the South African Reconciliation Barometer, which was hosted by the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation and facilitated by the Nelson Mandela Youth Convention at the Nelson Mandela University. So that is Ndombuvuyo Linda. Okay, so now we're done with almost everybody. Before we do that, we're not supposed to be where we were supposed to be because now there is load shedding. So I'm going to call a staff member from the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation just to tell us what's happening, water, and if we want to go outside, where do we go, and all that is here. Oh, okay.
Hello everyone, we're sorry about the situation. We're supposed to be, I know there's pillars here and you perhaps can't see very clearly. We're supposed to be in the upstairs venue, but due to load shedding, there's no generator power that side, so we had to come downstairs. There's also no water in this venue, so if you do need to use the bathrooms, please be cognizant of that. And other than that, we just welcome you and hope that you enjoy the event and find it insightful.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're ready. So we want to start with yourself, Marianne. I'm going to give you a few minutes. 20 minutes is quite solid.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Just what you're picking out from your writings, your experiences, the world over, the meaning of all in South Africa, and also what is right-wing racism conceptually, so that we are together in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, I need the mic.
I think so.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming to this event. It's very special, and I'm very pleased to have been invited. Thank you very much, and hello to my fellow panelists. I'd like to begin by splitting the title of tonight's panel discussion into two parts. And I'll begin with the rise of the right-wing racism globally, and then the second part of my discussion will be the links to South Africa. I've realized that because I've been immersed in this a bit, I need to sort of encapsulate it. I only have 20 minutes, so I've got to cover a lot of history, so there might be something left out, and you're welcome to enter the discussion at some point if you like. Turning to the rise of the extreme right wing globally, we have to begin with the acknowledgement that Europe is a volatile and genocidal continent. The Second World War claimed the lives of 55 million people, more people than are alive in South Africa today. At least 8 million of the dead, Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, the differently abled, the sick, the weak, the vulnerable, were officially scapegoated, dispossessed, numbered, put on a train, and exterminated. In Stalin's USSR, 20 million people were executed, and 30 million more died fighting for the Allies. This was a war, the Second World War, that was sparked by an economic crisis, Germany post-World War I, a crisis that was used by a white supremacist and racist Adolf Hitler to render Western Europe and Germany itself ultimately in ruins, bombed back to ground zero. Thousands of years of so-called civilization buried in rubble, books and paintings burnt and destroyed, a country shattered. It was about the supremacy of the Aryan race. It was also about blood. It was about soil. It was about control. It was about violence. But it was also about scapegoating, and it was about killing. It appealed to every atavistic human impulse, en masse. These racist ideas, while the Human Rights Charter, adopted after the devastation of World War II, and which had hoped to see them eradicated in the world, never again, we said, lived on and live on. These ideas are the bedrock of so-called Western civilization. They underpinned colonialism, they underpinned imperialism, violent, cruel, and parasitic. In the 20th and 21st century, a series of economic crises sparked the revival of this atavistic self-preservatory impulse, and that is actually embedded in the DNA of this old world, and that has now spread itself across the globe as it did before in the 19th century. After a period of post-war calm and prosperity, and a new economic model began to take shape, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, we're talking about Europe and the Western world, and in Africa, independence is happening. But then two major events occur that shift the global political landscape. The first is the collapse of communism in 1989, and the second is the implosion and the collapse of capitalism in 2008. The gap in between, the 20th century expansion of one-size-fits-all capitalism across the globe called globalization, would not lead in the end to free trade and open borders, but to increasing job losses, lower wages, massive migration, and growing global poverty and inequality. It would lead to a growing ultra-wealthy political and economic elite. It led to a criminalized form of capitalism. These were the issues that were first taken up by the political left in the 1990s, the anti-globalization movement. But it was gradually this disconnect between economic policy and the lives of ordinary human beings across the globe became a rallying point in some countries known as the North and Western liberal democracies, and has been claimed as the arena in which the alt-right thrives. So for years, the white right wing was viewed in Europe, across Europe, as existing on the fringes of political life, as something strange and fringy, not going to happen. They were a laughing stock of anti-intellectual, nationalist, racist, Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, populist rabble. In the United States, however, the extreme right, embodied in the murderous Ku Klux Klan, has never really gone anywhere. It's always been there, and it's been out of the shadows. It doesn't hide itself. Now, in the 21st century, we have a dangerous added ingredient tossed into this very old toxic mix. It's the internet, a place where extremism has thrived, where recruitment and funding has taken place, and where social media networks like Facebook have been used to mobilize mob violence in Burma, in the UK, in the US, and Europe. It has amplified rage and anger instead of bringing people together across borders. The rage on the internet is disembodied. It doesn't belong in the body of the person. It's hiding behind something. And it's global, and it feeds on the worst of human qualities: rage, hatred, willful ignorance, violence, and seemingly without consequence. Until some white supremacist walks into a mosque in New Zealand and mows down 42 people. And that's what happened. That is the consequences of this disembodied space in which this rage and hatred is being spat out. At present, there are those who seek to create a new world. The shape of this new world is vague, but they have leaped in to exploit this sort of resurgence of toxic hatred. Steve Bannon, who's Donald Trump's erstwhile advisor, is on a global mission to grow something called the Movement. It's a project linking members of so-called endangered white race across the globe. Bannon has formed links with the most hateful of people, neo-Nazis in Europe. He's trying to set up an academy in Belgium. They've chased him out. But he's making links and forging links everywhere, speaking to what is known as the white right. And then there's Alexander Dugin, Putin's Rasputin, a philosopher who believes that only chaos in the world will bring a renewal of a sort of Eurasian superstate in opposition to the US, which would be destroyed ultimately. This is Dugin's philosophy. So we have Bannon, we have Dugin. These are two of the philosophers who move in this realm. In 1997, in the Basics of Geopolitics, Dugin wrote that in principle, Eurasia and our space, the heartland Russia, remain the staging area of a new anti-bourgeois, anti-American revolution. The new Eurasian empire will be constructed on the fundamental principle of the common enemy, the rejection of Atlanticism, strategic control of the USA, the refusal to allow liberal values to dominate us. This common civilizational impulse will be the basis of a political and strategic union. This is Alexander Dugin's idea of the new world. This creation of enemies, hatred, discrimination, violence, and rage are the hallmarks of populist extremists on the alt-right and on the fascist left. Now, the links to South Africa. What do we mean by the right wing in South Africa? And does it currently pose a threat to the well-being of our fragile constitutional democracy? This, we must bear in mind, is a democracy which guarantees the rights and freedoms of all its citizens, including minorities. It is a constitution that in the late 1990s, when it was adopted, was the envy of the world for its humanity, for its leaning towards justice, for the deep understanding that human beings, no matter how different, can coexist in mutual respect. When we speak of the white right or the white right wing in South Africa, who are we talking about? Is this a cohesive group of people, all white, who share a vision and ideology? Do they belong to a specific language or cultural group? What is their ultimate goal? South Africa has a long history of white right-wing thought and mobilization. I mean, the entire concept of apartheid and racial purity, racial segregation and white supremacy was the epitome of the apartheid state, of pre-democratic South Africa. And while among white English-speaking South Africans, there is a notion that the white right is made up of mostly Afrikaners, this is untrue. The so-called white right and its links to fascist ideology and populist groupings in Europe is not a new phenomenon in South Africa. Old Nazi sympathizers found a welcoming embrace in apartheid South Africa. Janusz Wallus, the man who assassinated Chris Hani, was Polish. Clive Derby Lewis, the man who claimed to have planned the murder, was an English-speaking South African. Keith Conroy was an English speaker who was a commandant of the AWB's Eystergarde. An Italian, Armando Pellincin, was the leader of the Afrikaner Fascista movement. The Nationalist Socialist Party, which is modelled on Hitler's party, was funded by Dr. Paul Ducey. There are New Zealand twins, Christopher and Robert Gross, who protected Treblanche as well. In South Africa, we could loosely define three groupings of people who could be defined as right-wing. Afrikaners then, if you will, the first is a group of people who view themselves as Afrikaners who seek self-determination as a viable option of self-preservation of their culture, language, and that happens to be uniquely African and South African. Afrikaners, if you will, see themselves as a legitimate white tribe of Africa. A tribe which claims legitimacy along with other tribes. This is in fact what Clive Derby Lewis used to talk about when he was a member of the Conservative Party. He saw white Afrikaners as a tribe, an African tribe, which is quite interesting in contrast to what English-speaking white South Africans, or how they might view their place in the world. These are Afrikaners who actually seek a homeland or a fault start, a KZN tribal authority-like body that will find them a space in the world. Oranje is such a homeland, and it's important to remember that while it's been in existence for 23 years, there only are about 10,000 inhabitants. So in essence, this grouping of people, and they're by no means the majority of Afrikaans speakers, it's a minority, there is a longing for an exclusive cultural and linguistic and economic enclave. The bulk of white Afrikaans speakers don't see themselves as a nation apart from the rest of South Africa, however. In fact, this is a group that has thrived in post-apartheid South Africa. And it's a failure of political leadership on all fronts that has led to a sense of alienation amongst some of these moderate South Africans. The land issue, which has researched and has been there constantly, has exacerbated feelings of paranoia and marginalization amongst some of these groups. Afrikaners themselves are the third largest language group in South Africa after Zulu and Xhosa. Afrikaners who identify as South Africans vote for a variety of parties, including the ANC, the DA, the UDM, COPE, who is currently at present wooing them like mad. Afrikaners have thrived in post-apartheid South Africa. More books are published in Afrikaans than any other indigenous language. More films are made in Afrikaans than any other indigenous language. Afrikaners earn, according to their own websites, on average 20,000 rand a month per household. Afrikaners live across the country. Kuro Schools is listed on the JSE. There are 5 or 4 or 5 TV channels, music concerts, extraordinary festivals. Afrikaners have been able to establish and live and thrive in a diverse South Africa and continue. Their language is not under threat. In fact, Tito Mboweni spoke out in defense of Afrikaans recently. So we have a grouping of South Africans, of Africans who are very much part of the larger South Africa. Now the second grouping of white right-wing are white militant supremacists inspired by Hitler, his ideas, and ideas of racial purity, and who are convinced that this white race is in danger of extinction, and they have some kind of supernatural, godly task to fight off the hordes of everyone who isn't like them. They're English-speaking, they're Afrikaans-speaking, they're all white, they're mostly Christian. They feel threatened and hostile to almost everyone else, black people, Muslims, Jews, feminists, homosexuals, anyone who isn't like them, and these form smaller, more dangerous groupings, disparate groupings. There's very little cooperation between them. These are actually vigilante groupings or militia groupings like the Boeramag, the Boerenstaat Partij. There are WhatsApp groups with ex-military men in charge of areas, training people. The AWB currently runs training, shooting workshops every weekend. The Zuidlanders, who were featured on CNN recently, are preparing for the end of days. They have been for the last 20 years. So maybe we should go and help them and sort of, shut it down in some way. The Belgian right wing invited the Zuidlanders to address the European Parliament, and they did. Our government allowed people to travel to Europe and speak about white genocide. There are many other groupings, AfriForum and others, who have connected with Trump and Bannon and others in the North, the white North, promoting this idea of a white genocide. Katie Hopkins has visited us from Europe, from England. There's Australian Peter Dutton, who's offered farmers a place to live. There are Russian businessmen here trying to recruit white farmers to work there. So extremism of all shades is gaining traction, and in an increasingly unstable world with weak, unreliable and self-serving political leadership is doing little to imagine a post-global world. Whether these supporters that I'm speaking about wear black, or they wear brown, or they wear red, any party or group that calls for violence, for exclusion on ethnic or any grounds, who claim a geographical space exclusively to one group or the other, I would regard as right-wing. I did a story for the Daily Maverick, 4,000 words, as it had become increasingly evident that there is an enormous amount of movement among white right-wing groupings. They're stocking of weapons. There was an arrest recently in the Eastern Cape. I don't know if you saw it, farmers raided. People are storing bombs, people are storing all sorts of incendiary devices and, whatever you can find on the open market. When I spoke to the RVB leader about what he actually wanted, why are you training? What are you doing every weekend? In a place that is called the West Transvaal, which doesn't exist anymore, but let's leave it, it's on his GPS. And I speak Afrikaans because I was raised in Pretoria, and so you can't tell that I'm not Afrikaans. And I think he got comfortable, because in the end I said to him, what do you want? You've got everything you need. And he said, well, first of all, we're not going to be the aggressors, so we are going to defend ourselves. So they're constantly on high alert, and then in the end he said to me, I'll say it to you in Afrikaans because it sounds so disgusting. He said, ja, maar meisie, dit gaan oor wit suiwerheid. So ultimately, girl, I'm 60 nearly, it's about white purity. And when I said to him, what does that mean? He said, well, what do you mean? What do you mean, what does that mean? And I said, you're a minority in Africa. Did you not learn when your own leader was murdered, found with his underpants? And he's, I've realized there's nothing you can do to change these people's point of view. What we need to do is know they exist. We need to engage with those who I think are not as extreme. We need to find out what their problem is, what they want. I think there's a failure of leadership amongst Afrikaans, the Afrikaans community itself. People are being used, manipulated. And there's a failure of general leadership to try and include, or address some of the concerns of these people. So I'm not sure if that makes sense to all of you. We can extrapolate it later. But is my 20 minutes up? Was I on time? Have I got 5 minutes left?
Yeah, no.
That's me.
Yeah.
So thank you. I hope that makes sense.
Thank you. Woo! Sorry. No, thank you very much. Very informative. So I think we still come back to how, at a global level, in South Africa, the modus operandi of these groupings, and to what extent, particularly in South Africa, has these groupings used the democratic space, both in terms of taking advantage of the constitution, as well as the courts and all that. I'm sure those are the things we're gonna cover. So, Danielle?
Hi, Madeleine. Cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. I feel a bit like Pravin Gordhan must have felt yesterday. Basically, he was explaining something that he knows a little bit about, but that he has no solutions to whatsoever. He admitted he has no solutions to them whatsoever. Jabu Mabuza agreed that there were no solutions whatsoever. And that's kind of how I feel. I can tell you what happened to me, and I can tell you about my own experiences, but I would be lying if I said I had a definitive solution to this. I also kind of feel like I've felt my entire life in a way which stems from high school, which is that everyone else is a little bit more prepared than me and has done their homework better than I have. Because Marianne read from a computer speech, she'd clearly prepared quite a bit.
Sorry.
Hello?
Yeah.
In Tambavuyo, you've got a whole speech that you've written out. You guys will be proud to know, made some notes on my phone. And I'm now going to try and make sense of them.
For you guys.
With the mic cutting out occasionally. I'm going to try and make sense of my notes. And,
Hello.
Sorry, the mic cuts out occasionally. So I don't want to pretend that I'm coming from a perspective of research, which I think the other two on the panel with me have done a lot of research on this topic. Rather, I'm coming from a... Sorry, I don't know how to fix microphones. It's not in my skill set.
Are you fine?
Hello?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so I'm not going to come. The mic has gone into stage 2. It's not stage 4 yet. So you can still hear every 4th word that I say. Should I just keep talking? Okay, cool. Is it my mic technique? No, it's cutting out.
Yeah.
Maybe the
It's
battery's
not-
flat in the back of the mic. It's always the woman who has to tell the guys the batteries are flat.
I think it's just a battery.
Do you have like an extra?
Or just a change of batteries. Marianne's going to fix it.
Yeah, they'll give you injury time as well.
Thank you. Voila.
Cool, I'm so glad.
Battery? Anyone got a battery? Okay, good. This is what it is. You know how you do that thing when you hit the remote, but it doesn't work? When the batteries are flat and then it works again. We're going to do that. That goes in there.
Yeah.
Sorry, I broke it now. No, I haven't. It's working.
Hello.
Just keep your hand on it. You're going to drop that thing.
So let's touch wood. I'm not going to come from a research perspective, as I've explained. Rather, what I'm going to do is simply relate what happened to me and how it fits into our topic of discussion tonight. And I just want to start by saying that despite what a lot of people have said, I never made fun of farm murders. So that's a good place to start. What did happen is that I was included in a video where what I would describe as an alt-right vlogger, although he denies being alt-right, accused me of having made fun of farm murders. The reason why he accused me of this is quite simple. In a way, you could say I drew first blood, because I am not just a comedian these days. I'm also, I promise you, this is a battery issue. Sorry. So, I am not just a comedian these days. Should I just keep soldier on? Should I just abandon the mic? Maybe that's the...
I think that's
okay, that's the solution. Okay. So, I'm not just a comedian these days, I'm also the digital news editor of The Citizen. And I received information in my mailbox from a source who had basically been following. So I received information in my inbox from a source who had basically been following something called the Discord leaks. Now, the Discord leaks is something by a left-wing group in America called Unicorn Riot, where what they've done is they've exposed global and mainly American sort of right-wing chat groups on a platform called Discord. Although nothing had been said in the media about this, they had also turned their attention to some South Africans as well. One of those groups and one of those South Africans is the guy who made the video about me. Now, I've made a decision to not name him tonight. And I think I was inspired by the Prime Minister of New Zealand, who said that she wasn't going to give the shooter in the mosque killing the pleasure or the attention of saying his name. The guy who I'm talking about has kind of become Voldemort to me. His presence in my life is so... basically, it makes me feel more comfortable not to mention him. And I can say in all confidence that you guys do not need to watch his videos. So you can just imagine what they like. And if you really want to, you can do a bit of research on the matter and you can track down the guy. But I would advise not to. Basically, he was part of a group, and the group was in his name, and the group had posted various memes. I'm sure all the younger people in the audience know exactly what memes are. Just in case, in the unlikely event anyone doesn't, it's basically the way that people communicate these days via pictures, sharing jokes via pictures. But the content of these memes were objectively racist. A lot of the stuff was, so some of the stuff was sort of your typical black people are monkeys type of thing. So there were pictures of like black people portrayed as monkeys. You can go onto the article if you want. It's got the salacious headline of far-right, shocking racist memes of far-right vloggers exposed, or something like that. Okay, so there we go. There is the microphone. We're going to try this again. So like I was saying, were you guys following all the parts where I didn't have a microphone? Good, because that would be very far back to go if you didn't. So basically these memes were, some of them were blatant racist things, you know, black people are monkeys. Others were sort of apartheid nostalgia. So there was a lot of like pictures of Hendrik Verwoerd looking very sort of like busts of him looking very lovely or whatever. Then there were your Nazi memes. There were lots of like swastikas, stuff like that. And so there was a lot of research that the source had done. Now, I will be the first person to tell you I'm not an investigative journalist. My detractors will tell you as well that I'm definitely no investigative journalist. What I did do is get a source who I trusted, who I spoke to about this, and I looked at what I had until I was satisfied that this was real and that this was worth reporting on. And I did a story in which I published the racist memes. Now, the person whose group it was in and some of his associates really, really didn't like it, obviously. And that's one of the things that I want to discuss, is the fact that I feel like there is a strange desire among a lot on the right in South Africa to not be considered right-wing. I know that sounds bizarre, but if you look at AfriForum, AfriForum is an organization that I would say most South Africans would consider overtly right-wing. However, they will tell you that they are not a right-wing or left-wing organization. They are a non-politically aligned organization who's simply lobbying for certain minority rights causes. And that's what they'll tell you. Now, that becomes a little bit tricky when you consider the fact that AfriForum just the other week put out a video in which there's a clip within the video of someone basically glorifying Hendrik Verwoerd with like lovely piano music in the background and explaining how he wasn't the architect of apartheid, he was just a philosopher who's been misunderstood. AfriForum have also said to me that I've misunderstood their views on apartheid, but there's an article on Politics Web which explains Ernst Ruth's views on apartheid, and if you read it, I'm sure you will agree that his own views, in his own words, are every bit as bad as everything that he's accused of, including, you know, his backing up of Callie Creel, his CEO's assertion that apartheid wasn't a crime against humanity. There's a dispute over the death toll of apartheid with Callie Creel saying, I don't know what the exact number is, but only a few people died. Well, basically not that many people died. Please look at what he's written on the subject if you want the exact figure. So just yesterday they released a statement saying that Steve Hofmeyr, that they accused MTN of racism for pulling out their sponsorship from an event featuring Steve Hofmeyr. So obviously the reason why they pulled out of the event featuring Steve Hofmeyr is because Steve Hofmeyr is widely considered to be racist. So there's this weird sense of turning around the word racist, of saying, no, we're not the racists, you're the racists. And I see that a lot on the right. And in my discussions with Voldemort, because I did end up on WhatsApp with him, and I did end up actually speaking to him, what I found bizarre is that he argued to me that he isn't himself alt-right. He says that he's been misconstrued. He says that he's just a libertarian, right-of-center guy. And there is this very bizarre sense that I get on the right of people not wanting to own the term. And what the reason for that is, I couldn't tell you. But I do think that it might have something to do with, you know, what the word right-wing means historically and currently in South Africa. I think there might be a sense, and I also think there's the struggle for AfriForum at least, for mainstream acceptance and to be seen as a mainstream organization, something which they've so far struggled to do, but which they continue to try and do. I've gotten off the topic of what happened to me. So what happened to me is I put out this article exposing these racist memes. And the guy, Voldemort, made a video about it, which didn't get very far. No one really watched the video, a few thousand people, and I got a couple of threads, and it went to air, and I thought, okay, it's fine. But Voldemort was not happy with this, because he felt that I had unfairly portrayed him in this piece. He's also argued that he hasn't posted these memes himself, and that his argument is really weird. So this is someone who not a lot of people have heard of, but yet he says a fan in the UK made the group. The reason why the group's in his name, he argues, is because a fan in the UK made this group in his name. But this is also someone who lies pretty much pathologically. So, you know, it's pretty much, you know, I mean, the ombudsman is not, the ombudsman the journalist ombudsman is among those who will tell you that, you know, this group is definitely the guy's group. So, but he felt smeared, or he felt wronged, or he felt just uncomfortable being in the public eye in this way. And so what he managed to do, and this was genius in a way, so he went back, and as a comedian, I have been doing a song since 2013, 2012 called The White Genocide. Now, what the song is quite a hard-hitting song, like a lot of my satire is, and you know, some of the people who are on the left even expressed a feeling of like that they were uncomfortable with it, but because my style is quite confrontational when it comes to my satire. But what the song does is it makes fun of the idea of the white genocide. So what it doesn't make fun of is farm murders. And I would like to say that it's sad to me that the issue of farm murders has become indivisible from the global right now. Farm murders in South Africa. And I say the global right because, so while Marianne is a lot better than me at telling you exactly who worldwide is connected to this, to the local right, what I did notice is after the mosque shooting, I'm sure a lot of you guys are aware of the fact that there was a senator from Australia called Fraser Anning. He put out a statement, and his statement was, you know, I mean, it was disgusting, and I don't think there's any way to describe it as anything but that. And in his statement, right after the mosque attack, he said that the reason for the mosque attack is immigration of Muslims to New Zealand and Australia, that Islam is an inherently violent religion, that Muslims are savages, basically. I think he actually used the word savage or backward or something like that, and that basically, while Muslims weren't the perpetrator today, they would be tomorrow, and that they need to shoulder the blame for 50 of their own innocent people being shot in a mosque attack. So obviously it was a very, you know, you don't have to be a crazy leftist to find that disgusting, and it was widely considered in the Australian mainstream a disgusting statement. The reason why I mention this guy is because when I Googled him and when I researched him, it turns out that one of his main topics of conversation, when you look him up, is farm murders in South Africa. Does that mean that farm murders in South Africa are not a thing, that they don't happen and they aren't a horrific crime? Absolutely not. But it's extremely sad that the issue of farm murders has become tied into the global right. For whatever reason, and because of, in my opinion, it's the sense of white victimhood that you're trying to push. What a lot of these people believe is that the white racist supremacy is not only in question, but that the race as a whole is in question, because people are trying to sort of mix and match and have sex with whoever you like, and next thing the dominance of Europeans will be no more, and this is what a lot of these guys fear. And because of that, they see the farm murders in South Africa as sort of a reinforcement of their view that white people are an endangered species. And obviously we know that this is not the case, but this is what they believe. So it's sad to me, because what I found out tonight, which I didn't know, is that the guy who made the video about me, his grandparents were killed on a farm. And other right-wing people who I've spoken to have also had these experiences. And I just, you know, I wish I could tell each one of those people that I wouldn't wish that on anyone. No one's laughing about farm murders, and no one's saying farm murders are a good thing. I think what everyone's saying is that we're all in this together. We're all dealing with huge, massive, crime and stress and murder as South Africans. And for you to isolate yourselves as being uniquely targeted is obviously going to be a view that people are not going to appreciate. And the fact that you've gone running to people like Donald Trump, the fact that you've gone running like AfriForum has, is obviously not going to bolster your cause, because now you want to say to someone like me, why don't you care about farm murders? And it's not at all that I don't care about farm murders, it's that I object to the way that farm murders have been politicized in this way. So that's that. And so basically, he made a video about my white genocide song, which doesn't mention farm murders once, but it does make fun of the idea of a white genocide. Now, as a Jew, the word genocide is nothing to be taken lightly. I'm sure you guys are aware of the Rwandan genocide and how many people died there. I'm sure you guys are aware of the Holocaust and how many people died there. And so the word genocide is just something that I object to it being harnessed in this way. It doesn't mean you're not allowed to be devastated and you're not allowed to mobilize in some way when your family gets murdered. What it does mean is that simply what's happening in South Africa to white people is not genocide. And even Voldemort, when I've probed him long enough, has admitted this and has in fact denied having ever used the term white genocide. So my video made fun of the idea of white genocide. It was also shortly before Nelson Mandela passed away, and it was connected to the fact that there was this idea of the Night of Long Knives, that white people feared that as soon as Mandela was passed away, because he was seen as being, the voice of moderation, the voice of negotiation, and that without him there, a lot of more radical voices would say, but hey, wait a second, why don't we get rid of all the white people? So this was a theory that was going around before Mandela's death, and which was being shared mainly by white people in South Africa. And what my video did was make fun of that. And the white genocide then, less so, and now much more so, is connected to farm murders, because there are those who believe that farm murders are a genocide. And because of that, this guy made a video and he said, this disgusting guy, deep fried man, has made fun of farm murders. And he put this video out there. And the reason why this is something to note and something that I'm telling you guys about is because of the response I got. What I got was massive outrage, massive threats. And what it made me realize is that while the South African right is, in a way smaller and less active than the ones in other countries such as the US, it is there and it is extremely active. And I want to say that what Marianne said is extremely important, that I think the idea that this narrative, or that this far-right narrative represents Afrikaans people, is one that I simply have not seen based in reality. I think that a lot of these organizations, whether they're more moderate right-wing organizations like AfriForum, or less so like, what are they called, the guys in the CNN article?
Oh, the Saitlanders.
The Saitlanders, whether they're more extreme guys like that. I've lost my train of thought. Basically, I would argue that Afrikaans people, it's a culture, and it's something that I'm an alternative kind of guy. I like alternative music, I like alternative culture, and growing up, people like Breyten Breitenbach, the poet, the full-frame movement during apartheid of Afrikaans rock and rollers, guys like Johannes Kerkorrel, who's no longer with us. These were guys who inspired me a lot. And so what I feel is a very harmful thing is this sense that by opposing the right in South Africa, you are opposing Afrikaans people. I think this is a dangerous idea that is perpetrated by some on the Afrikaans right. And like Marianne said, I don't think that the views of the Afrikaans right in South Africa, which, as she noted as well, is not even the predominant voice on the right. Many on the right in South Africa are not, white people who are on the right in South Africa are actually English speaking. So not only is it wrong that the right wing in South Africa is Afrikaans, but it's wrong that the right in South Africa represents the Afrikaans. And I just want to say that. Anyway, is my time up?
Yeah.
Can I just say one more thing? Okay, I didn't get into all the threats that I was sent. I was told to make a list of my solutions to this problem. So I just wanted to get to the solutions. So my solutions are, number one, my suggestion is we could kill them all. So we could kill everyone on the white right. So we could either do it one by one or in a kind of group thing. I'm just kind of spitballing here. The problem with that is it's illegal. Also, people will say that you're wrong, you're just as bad as them, all of that sort of stuff. But I'm just brainstorming. The second suggestion is you could ask them nicely to stop being right-wing. That was my second suggestion. My third thing is mind control. We could hypnotize them into being better people. That was my suggestion. Or the fourth one is you could kill them with kindness. You could send them gift baskets and compliment their hair. Because, I mean, who's going to hate someone after you've complimented their hair? Then the other one is if you can't beat him, join him. And you could become a member of the right. Of course, that will be easier for me because I'm white. You know, I mean, not everyone can just go to an AfroForum meeting and be accepted. I'm just brainstorming, guys, you know, I'm not saying. My sixth suggestion is to end load shedding. That has nothing to do with the global right, but I just really want to watch TV when I get home tonight. So I joke, but basically what I'm trying to say is that I don't have a solution. We can talk all night, but I think what Marianne says is correct. This is something that's not going away. And maybe all we can do is educate. And maybe all we can do is, part of me thinks that what we need to do is engage. And that if we engage, maybe we can find enough common... Because at the end of the day, people can make as many videos about me as they want. Even if those videos culminate in my son being threatened with his skull being smashed, which is what happened. Because I think the fact that a lot of these guys know about this event tonight but aren't here is telling. A lot of these guys are a lot more bark than bite. A lot of these guys are not actually wanting to do anything. But the fact that this mosque shooting just happened and that the Pittsburgh shooting happened 2 years before that shows that it can translate into real violence and real harm. And I guess what we need to confront is the question of how do we stop this from becoming a mass shooting? And how do we, you know, and the problem is that on an ideological level, all it takes is one person who's willing to take that ideology to its most extreme conclusion for something like what happened in New Zealand to happen. And I'm way out of time, and all I can say is that I wish I had the answers, and I'm sorry that I don't.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, so we'll take Ndombo for you.
So you're right, I did write like a whole speech. I'm a podium girl and I'm a researcher. So I will be coming from a very academic perspective when it comes to this topic. I think what most of the panelists here have highlighted is that, you know, every day when we open up the newspaper and media, there are always these big headlines about recent galvanizing provocation by a particular right-wing populist party, or yet another success of such a party had recently held national regional elections. We've seen this in France, we've seen it in Sweden, we've seen it in the States, of course, being the major example. And the rise and indeed discursive prominence of right-wing populist politics currently seems to be without end. So these are dangerous times, I think, for democracy, and democracy is greatly under threat. And countries that once actually offered democratic hope are now, in varying degrees, falling into extremist policies. Historically, national categories have been formed in various ways through conquests, colonization, immigration, of course, also in the modern alternatives of these categories under the sway of capitalism, imperialism, as well as the most prominent political form, and that being of liberal democratic state, through multiculturalist talk, right? Where certain groups now are being defined as minority groups, or indigenous or native groups, which further essentializes and actually obfuscates differences in the construction of differences. For example, immigrants from South Asia can be defined as both ethnic, racial, or religious, using the terms Pakistani, black or Muslim, or Jews in different contexts can be constructed as primarily religious groups, ethnic or national groups. So therefore groups that have been called or have even called themselves national at one point or in one territory have actually become ethnic or racial in other contexts. And you know, the use of one or the other of these categorizations has often been determined by the political intentions of those involved. So it's always about power. Racialized and ethnic national groups, I think, also involve the positing of boundaries in relation to who can and who cannot belong, according to certain parameters which are extremely heterogeneous, ranging from the credentials of your birth, being born in the right place, conforming to cultural or other symbolic practices, such as language, and very centrally behaving in sexually appropriate ways. And I think that the gender discourse is often also very much neglected when it comes to nationalist and right-wing politics. And so though these boundaries are ideological, they also involve material aspects and practices, and therefore they are material and they have material origins and effects, you know. So the boundary is a space for struggle and negotiation. Ethnic resources such as language, culture, religion, and gender relations can be used in interplay with the class and political resources and positionings of different groups. So ethnic processes are often also implicated, therefore, in the pursuit of diverse political ends. And these may involve exclusionary and inclusionary practices for maintaining the privileges along a number of different dimensions, or for countering those of other groups. Therefore, race and ethnicity have become mediums for class, nation, and state formation. And in this way, nationalist projects have been centered around claims and practices for separate political representation, territory, and unification. In the United States, Donald Trump poses the greatest threat, I think, to American constitutional order. And yet, despite the stumbling first year and a half of his presidency, the opposition has yet to find its voice in America, you know. And one might think that his inflammatory tweets, his erratic behavior, his persistent disregard for democratic norms would offer the opposition an easy target, but you know, it hasn't really worked out this way. And I think that's why we're here, we're trying to find out why is this so, you know. Similarly, in right-wing populist parties in Europe have also been gaining strength for years. So I think also having done research ahead of, you know, the discussion here today, a lot of these right-wing populist organizations and populist parties have actually been growing over a number of years. And I think what we're seeing now is the peak, you know. So we've seen this in Italy, Sweden, Germany, and France. So in Sweden, for instance, the Sweden Democrats, who were once a pariah in the Swedish politics given its past associations to neo-Nazism, first entered parliament in 2010, but they really broke through in 2014 when they took 13% of the vote. And long before immigration became an issue for Europeans as it is today, the Sweden Democrats were battering away at Sweden's relatively open migration policy. And in Sweden's elections just last year, this very same Sweden Democrats actually took 17.6% of the vote. So we see an increase there. And furthermore, Google searches for white genocide have actually grown dramatically over the past several years, reflecting the rise of white supremacist ideology. Searches peaked when Trump was elected, and quite interestingly as well, have been most concentrated in South Africa, the United States, and New Zealand. South Africa is ranked one of the top there when it comes to these searches. So I think there are also settings for this kind of right-wing extremism, especially in countries of what some may call the Anglo-American diaspora, which enhance our comparative understanding of the phenomena under consideration. The legacy of racism and apartheid in both the United States and South Africa, I think still plays a considerable role on the extremist margins of politics. And in the current turbulent climate of South African politics, the dividing lines between moderate and extreme right-wing politics have also become very blurred, you know. But I think now I really want to talk about how the body plays a central role when we talk about, you know, right-wing nationalist politics and how the body is used as a site of political expression in its varying forms, in its gendered forms, in its racialized forms. So, you know, I think the discussion here today has sort of highlighted how race and racism is actually used as a structuring or organizing principle for national projects and processes by defining both the boundaries of the nation and the constituents of national identity, where different elements of national projects such as citizenship, culture, religion, and origin have actually become racialized. So the preoccupation of these racialized bodies in the polity actually forges hegemonic views of what an optimal citizen is, you know. So citizenship rights are not available for bodies that transgress cultural, social, sexual, and political boundaries. And I think that also the main thing that we're trying to find out through discussions such as these is how do governments then respond to political demands of bodies that transgress these normative boundaries, and in what ways do transgressive bodies that cross state boundaries challenge national and international power relations. And I want to talk a little bit more again about the politics of the integration, exclusion, and containment through national politics, and how this comes across quite strongly in right-wing politics. You know, the framing of the body is an especially contested site for national definition, and this demonstrates how the politics of integration, exclusion, and containment actually shape both domestic body politics and international practices and policies. So social structures function to maintain and reorganize, in fact, the categorization of bodies. So this means conferring or withholding rewards such as inclusion, belonging, and acceptance, or country-wise, administering marginalization and tenure. So the exclusion, regulation, and containment that has actually been deployed on the body has introduced new democratic shifts, you know, and new borderlands, frontiers, and diasporas, which have sort of generated new configurations of national imaginaries and bodies in contact. And I think that this has also highlighted issues such as cultural expansion, migration, transnational population flows, and discourses of national embodiment, which are all very much at the center of international politics and international relations, right? So if you look at the massive movements of bodies through migration, and how this has resulted in this complicated affair, you know, between deterritorialization and territorialization, which creates opportunities for new identities to be negotiated. And so migrants' bodies and their choreography actually challenge the body politic of the state and give new meanings to political agency. So I think also then a recurring theme in these right-wing nationalist politics has been the marketing that perceive threats to national and social security, public health, and development of the bodies of racialized others who are documented as foreign, alien, and perhaps even beyond humanity. And despite the globally established principle that discrimination and abuse on immigrants is actually a violation against human rights, many countries actually continue to ignore human rights violations against migrants and immigrants. And I think immigrants are also often abused, they're often exploited and become scapegoats and victims of racism, xenophobia, and stereotyping. And so in South Africa, you know, South Africa is a regional hub for migration on the African continent and is home to a growing number of documented international migrant communities, you know. And foreign nationals in this country, however, often face violations of their basic human rights and are victims of abuse. So I think it's all fair and fine for us to look at racism as black and white, but it's not always black and white. It's also, you know, especially when it comes to national body politic, it's also about us seeing ourselves as South Africans and then seeing everyone else who's not necessarily South African as belonging outside, as deserving less, as being less human. So I think that's also something that we need to consider when we talk about right-wing politics. We also need to look at South African policies and how they also reflect right-wing populist policies, you know. So, you know, foreign nationals in the country have faced violations of their basic human rights. The xenophobic attacks against foreign nationals in 2008, which according to the South African Human Rights Commission resulted in the deaths of approximately 56 people. Displacement and the outbreak of further community violence in 2015 actually exposed the continued vulnerability of foreign nationals, particularly from other African countries in South Africa. Subsequently, the discourse on migration in South Africa is often characterized by strong emotions, strong stereotypes, and contested statistics, which has had a significant impact on our country's immigration policy. So data from the 2013 South African Social Attitude Survey, which is a national representative opinion poll, reveals that many South Africans actually favor, I'm going to say this, many South Africans actually favor restrictive immigration policies and oppose granting foreigners the same rights as citizens. Many South Africans favor restrictive immigration policies and oppose granting foreigners the same rights as citizens. Over the years, 2 to 10 years, the white paper also proposes that permanent residence in South Africa be replaced with a long-term residence visa. Both the exceptional skills and quota permit have been completely eliminated and replaced by the critical skills permit. And this means that you can no longer apply for a visa as a result of exceptional ability. Rather, your skill or training must be in demand in South Africa. So I think within this framework of regulating bodies, people are treated as individuals which are unaffected by time, unaffected by space, and you know, this sort of framework assumes that people move mainly to maximize their individual profits, so relying solely on their own resources, reducing migrants to material objects of exchange. So I think that these regulations in South Africa also highlight the relationship between the body and space, or the interface of movement and geography, and how these interactions carry a symbolic and sensitive significance, which play an important role in establishing, maintaining, and disrupting relationships between people, as we have seen. So I think we also need to look at ourselves as South Africans and how we perceive ourselves, the attitudes that we have of ourselves. A lot of foreign nationals will actually say that, no, actually, a lot of South Africans will say, oh, they're in Africa. Where are we? You know? So this speaks to the colonial mentality that we have as well in the country. So I don't want us to look at racism just between, or just being about, rather, the internal politics in the country, but also how do we position ourselves in the world, you know? So the inside and outside divides that shape the meanings of the national bodies are actually powerful elements in public policy making and for national security discourse. And often national security discourse is very realist and has very strong sort of attachments to right-wing politics. So I think this has sort of provided for the justification of the exclusion of certain people from the national body, and many efforts to classify people into those who belong and those who do not actually offer on regulating bodies, particularly in systematically, structurally, and physically violent ways. So whether violence on the body is a political statement, or it's a dramatic display of power, authority, and strength in effort to gain control or advance an arbitrary set of interests. So I think also, as we discussed tonight, we also have to ask ourselves, what are the lessons that we can learn from ascending right-wing populism today? Is it a symptom of the failure of progressive politics? And, where do we stand in South Africa as South Africans?
Thank you very much, both of you. I think you have helped us by expanding beyond race and pushing ourselves and looking at the various dimensions of our democratic projects. To what extent ourselves, other than race, have we become right-wing in policy articulation, whether it's gender, it's xenophobia and all that. So we have a rounded picture that right-wing might not only just be the instance of race, but it could also be the instance of conservative politics, right-wing generally. So I think the discussion then is much more rounder, as it were. So we're not going to waste any time. We're going to take questions, comments. We don't have much time, but let me just take the first round. If you've got comments and questions on what Danielle, Marianne, and Dombovuyo have said.
Can I add something
Okay.
afterwards?
Yes.
Yeah.
You are all allowed to come back.
Oh, we're allowed to come back. Okay.
As
we go.
As you respond, yeah.
When Deep Fried Man is her name was speaking about solutions, and we then extended it into a wider net to look at our own conservative swing in South Africa. I think that what we need to then begin to talk about is the difference between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. And South Africa has the possibility to have a civic nationalism, which is where you identify yourself as South Africa and as part of the larger country. So when Samora Machel became the president of Mozambique, he said to everybody, you are Mozambicans, we are all Mozambicans. It's an important way to counteract ethnic nationalism, where people begin, a certain grouping in a geographic space begin to say we are the true occupiers of this space. And we live in an extremely complicated and complex geopolitical region, and we already have a constitution which was at some point the envy of the world, that is now being belittled. So when I travel to Europe, people say to me, but this diversity, this melting pot, this no borders thing doesn't work. And actually it does work, it can work. Because any other ideology that is about rage and hate and exclusion has ended in disaster. So I like to push the version idea. People think it's corny, it's Mandela's Rainbow Nation, it's anti-racism. I'm sorry, I will continue this discussion as it reaches further and further and further in light of Fees Must Fall and what that means, in light of decolonization and what that means, and where white South Africans, or those who identify themselves as white South Africans, not as South Africans, need to be approached and educated and engaged with, so that it doesn't become this hostile situation which could possibly turn violent, because people have armed themselves. They're sitting, some of the people are trained, they were in the military, they were in the police, they know how to organize villages. Hermanus has groups working, they're everywhere. They're in every town, they're in every city, they're mobilizing people on their WhatsApp groups. And so this idea of a civic nationalism, I think, is one potential way that we can begin to address who we are in the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Maria. Okay, can we take comments and questions short to the point? I'll start with yourself. 1. I might not come back. 2, 3, 4, 5. We're okay. I don't want you to be spared by a comment somewhere else. But okay, let's take the gentleman in front. Yes, I've got 5 speakers.
Okay, my name is Kenny Mobasa. I think I have a question for almost everybody. But I would like to start with the foundation itself. I'm sure you picked up from the media, particularly the social media, that FNB, First National Bank, has been overcharging black people you know, for the last few years. I'm sure you're aware of that. If you're not, there's a rumor that's really going around, which I'll expect black people to be very angry, or an institution or organization such as Ahmed Kathrada to perhaps do something about it. So maybe that's the first thing that I wanted to say. Secondly, we speak about left and right, this bipolar or this continuum, as if, you know, we're in the same boat, or all of us understand what's going on, what that is. I just, maybe from my learned colleagues, I really want to unpack that so that I understand what it means exactly. Another thing, the first speaker, I forgot the name, from the Daily Maverick, Mariana. Of course, you draw from, you know, textual from history. You spoke about the Second World War and its effect and stuff. But one thing that I didn't hear you say, one of the causes of the Second World War was money. Okay? But the question is, do you think somebody profit from racism in general?
Of course.
You know what I'm saying? If people profit, maybe you can be a little bit graphic on that, on how do they profit. Let me just hold it now, so that I don't be greedy.
Thank you very much to the panelists. My name is Kamil. I wanted to just perhaps pose a question about broader geopolitical space in which South Africa finds itself at the moment, particularly with regards to the BRICS relationship that we have with those other countries. A lot of sort of noise has been made around this relationship, but given the kind of very clear right-wing politics that are playing themselves out in those countries, particularly most recently with Bolsonaro in Brazil, how do you think that's going to affect sort of South Africa's policy and the kind of economic pressure that South Africa might be under, given that relationship?
My name is Mzefani Khotlowa. So I wanted to comment about the solutions. I think in our school curriculum, we do not have where we deal with the issues of racism. When we are talking about racism in our curriculum, it's just a paragraph like this, and then we are done. And then when we reach university, that's where we counteract other problems again. Now, which we never sorted them from the grassroots, from the bottom. So it becomes a huge problem because children in the school, they don't understand these things. It is my first time in such a sitting talking about racism. I don't remember at school having such topics about racism inside the classroom. Yeah, that's what I.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ricky. I live in Ward 58 in the city of Johannesburg, which comprises of the suburbs Wardsburg, Mayfair, Olmsted Park, Crosby, Vredendorp, Brixton. I want to say at the offset, I think I live in the most diverse ward in South Africa. We have over 23 nationalities. And initially, it was a suburb that was mainly white, or was white, and then in the late 80s was an influx of people of color. Subsequently, we've had a massive influx of people from all over the world. What I want to say is that there's such a lack of management of immigration into our country, and this comes down to weak political leadership. We welcome the different people of different race, color, creeds into our communities, and we have now massive settlements of people from all over the world. What we're noticing is a reverse trend where when you allow communities to come and settle in areas and do not integrate them into those communities, you allow communities to take over certain sections of suburbs And then you have that reverse racism, whereby these communities then turn on local communities. And I'll give you an example where we've been going out of our way to get the communities integrated and get social cohesion going. But because, again, and a very important point the brother brought up there is the material gain that this comes with this. And we get accused of being coolies, and we should go back to Calcutta. Now, I'm a descendant of a slave. My grandparents were brought, my great-grandparents were brought to South Africa to work on the cane fields. So it's no different to the slaves that were taken to America or anywhere else. It was exactly the same. It was just a modified version or a term saying indentured laborers. What I'm saying here is that government, civil society is not doing enough for social cohesion, for integration at that levels. And the brother's very right, this need to start at primary schools. And one of the legacies of apartheid is that we are still living in a society where we have townships. So majority of our kids, indigenous African kids, Indian, colored kids are growing up in township schools. They have no interaction with people of other colors. So this is something as the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation, as civil society and civil society activists that we need to look at, and how do we address it going forward. Thank you.
Number 5. Hi, okay, my name is Ahmed. I'm also from Ward 58, Mayfair. Daniel, I just wanted to ask you, because I think you'll be best placed to answer this question. There is this relationship between the Israeli right and the white right organizations in many parts of the world. It seems as though they seem to have to resonate much with each other. And I think I've noticed that also on Twitter, etc., and social media. The other phenomena which I would like to, Marian, I want to ask you is that, you know, we say Afrikaners generally are fairly well off, I mean, they're fairly well earning, etc. Just behind us, there is one of the last outposts of what I would call a poor white community, just behind us here in Jan Hofmeyer. I mean, if you look at them, I mean, they live very, in very shabby conditions, very badly educated, etc. And it is normally from those types of communities where you would expect the more blatant forms of racism. But having said that, I mean, then on the other side, we have the more affluent, you know, the professionals, who do not, well, you don't find the blatant forms of racism from them, but those are the professionals who will help, for instance, transformation. Like I'm in a legal profession, and we find it there with the white guys, you know, who control the profession, and you know, who use various means. It's not blatantly racist, but they use various means of, I mean, to hamper transformation. In fact, they even try and sound to be transformationists themselves, but they won't be. Okay, and also then the media narrative. I mean, a white person who commits acts of terror, very seldom do they call him a terrorist. I mean, a Muslim guy, even if it's not terror related, I mean, the word terrorist is automatically associated with a Muslim person. Then the other phenomena, I mean, if you look at Denmark, Canada, New Zealand, which have been sites of racism in the recent weeks or months. And I think the Denmark one was a few years ago, but still, I mean, these are countries which score very high on the human development indices, you know, rule of law indices. Why do these things happen in those countries? I mean, you would expect these things maybe to happen here. But since Barron's Trade Home, we haven't really had any major right-wing attack here. And then the other thing I must also say, well, I don't want to get into politics now, but our official opposition has captured 90% of the white vote in this country, and that's across the entire spectrum. Communities who in the past voted KP and NP are now voting for the DA, and let's face it, I mean, that's what's happening. How did this happen, that the so-called Liberal Party has managed to capture this far-right vote? The Freedom Front Plus doesn't even have a percentage of the vote which the Conservative Party did. Thanks.
Thank you very much. We are in the midst of politics as we talk now. We may not be in the political stuff, but we are right deep in that. I think the main I think, which is an issue that Marian and others raised, this issue of failure of leadership. We also raised that at a broader level, and leadership, politically speaking, as in politics, in our political process, leadership arising out of our business communities, leadership arising from the media space, as well as community organizations, civil society generally, which could help to cultivate social cohesion, as it were. So that has been identified as a real issue. By the way, it's not a South African phenomenon. Across the globe, there is this issue of failure of leadership, hence the growth of populist politics and the elites and globalization, which is not widespread and shared, the benefits thereof. So, who wants to take the first? Right? Okay.
That's good.
Good.
I'll try and answer as much as I can.
Yeah.
In relation to FNB and the banks, I'm not surprised. I'm not sure whether it has been confirmed or not. I'm also quite concerned at the moment that Standard Bank is losing 1,900 jobs at a time when it actually helped Gupta bank accounts. There's no sense of what that means to the 1,900 people who are going. So I think banks, if this turns out to be the case, then I think a class action would be in order, and compensation must be demanded from. The Second World War, you must understand, Britain at the moment was at a certain point when it came to the arms deal, exports more arms than any other product. Britain used to export cotton and cars and various other things. So I think we must never forget, in the complex idea of what was World War II and World War I, are the warmongers, the gun runners, the armaments factories that make money out of this. And in order for us to buy these arms, they need us to fight each other. They need human beings to turn on each other. Then they sell us the guns. So the markets and the economy after the Second World War also then feed into this. But there was a moment in time after the horror of the 55 million dead when the United Nations wrote this charter, this human rights charter. It is a lodestar that very few of us have managed to accomplish around human rights. But we in South Africa have got the closest to writing a constitution that embodies that charter of human rights, although very few people can say that they live up to all of them. You have to understand, capitalism is about resources. So when we speak about the poor white people in the township, capitalism needs us to fight each other for the resources. And when it's not politically well managed, people then turn on each other. So we as humans, as the objects of the politicians' attentions, whoever they may be, need to understand they need our votes to be in power. I don't know whether democracy has failed globally. It might have. It seems to be a ritual. The language of Trump is a language that is spread through the world. That's how people are speaking to each other. Rude, uncouth, disrespectful to anyone that isn't like him. He set the tone for this. So the banks don't surprise me. If we also look at the Gupta leaks, how much the financial sector, the legal sector, consultancies, global, stole the money. This is happening all over the world. The rich elite, and interestingly, it's state capitalism in China. And what's happened in the United States is that the oligarchs there have captured the Republican Party. So it's state capitalism as the Republican Party with Trump. I don't know if that makes sense. If there's any discrimination, I think in South Africa, we have the laws to make these banks pay, if that is indeed what they did. So I think let's go for it. Let's teach them a lesson. Let's teach people a lesson. BRICS, I'm not very good at answering that. I think we've just borrowed money from ourselves at BRICS and the countries that are interesting. Modi in India too is worrying in terms of the clampdown and the nationalism. Brazil and Russia. Russia too is concerning. I think South Africa, out of all the BRICS countries, we still have our moment where we can be this diverse country that subscribes to a notion of justice, and economic justice too. Economic justice, which we haven't touched on this evening. So the Fordsburg issue, it's a battle for resources. People are, globalization has reduced wages, has caused mass migration. Factories have closed and moved elsewhere, setting us upon each other as profits grow. So I want to ask Standard Bank, so you want to lose your staff, and I will still pay bank charges for every transaction I make. Where does that money go? Not to another human being to feed 6 mouths or 1 mouth or 3 mouths, to the top. So we need a radical new way of doing things, because this is not sustainable. What capitalism is doing to people in the world is not sustainable. And that's why there's this anger and there's a lack of political management around that. I think I might have left something out. White poverty, what happens there, the lack of racism, is those people do not see themselves as superior. They are one of the people. They are the people. They're suffering. They're part of the resources. But the vast bulk of white South Africans, English and Afrikaans speaking, have done incredibly well post-1994. Believe me. I come from Cape Town. We've done incredibly well. We still have our institutional wealth, our inherited wealth, and the ability, and our education, and our access to capital. So white South Africans are not under threat. And those poor white South Africans should be cared for. And there's a beautiful story of an EFF member, I loved it, I saw it in reports, who had said something, and then the Human Rights Commission said, you've got to go and work with poor white people for like 6 months. And it's so interesting. There's this photograph of him when he first made the tweet, something like, I don't know, kill them all, or whatever we say on Twitter. And then afterwards, when he began to engage with the community, his face changed completely, because he realized that these are just poor people. And they were not racist, interestingly enough. They were grateful. So we need to interact more. At school, I agree with you. My child's history teacher did not know who Hector Peterson is. I agree. Education is one way we can do this as well. If I've left out any questions, I'm not sure if my great fellow panelists will pick them up.
Yeah. So I actually wanted to share a story that's related to the discussion we had at the South African Reconciliation Forum to the launch last year, where I think, I'm not quite sure now, but so I think it was you, and you asked me, you have been born here, your parents were born here, your ancestors were born here, and why is that you as a Muslim or Indian South African cannot be defined as African? And I'm reflecting on my response to you, and I think I've changed my mind. Because I remember I said, why is that we as black people have to share our identity with everyone, people come here, they take our land, they take our minerals, they take our resources, and now people also want to take our identity too. Valid point, but I'm definitely now also learning that identity is fluid. And it is not a fixed thing, and it does not need to be fixed to one specific culture. Being African doesn't necessarily mean that you have to be black. And I think that kind of thinking that I had is actually part of the problem. When we want to separate ourselves from others, when they can identify in some form or other with us, And you mentioned it again today, I think I could remember, because even when you introduce yourself, that's the very first thing that you did. You introduced yourself. You said you are an Indian South African, you were born here, your roots are here. And yet, you find this a lot as well in EFF politics, where they believe that black is black and that's it. And when you're black, you need to behave this way, You can't be black and have this kind of hair. You can't be black and be that. And I think when it comes to racialized discussions, we also need to consider those things about how the context of our culture is changing and evolving as time goes, and how culture is starting to mean something different as there are economic and political changes. So I wanted to share that. And then I agree, definitely white South Africans are definitely not under threat. According to World Bank estimate, the top 7% of the country, which we know majority is white, control about 90% of the country's wealth and assets. And the bottom 60%, which we know the majority is black, control only about 7%. So, I mean, yeah, class politics definitely something also we need to consider, and the sort of the nuance that, the dynamics that it also introduces to the debate. Yeah, and then a lot of my panelists, former panelists here were also talking about, I think, the psychology of racists, you know, this paranoia. I kept hearing this word, paranoia. And I think this is what right-wing politics is all about. Folks is just paranoid. They are creating imagined realities, this, you know, white genocide that does not exist is just an excuse to be racist. So, yeah, and I think also part of the reason why a lot of right-wingers also don't want to outright call themselves right-wing is because they're actually ashamed. They know that these positions have no place in the world. And then someone was asking, I think Kenny, it was you, so you were asking about, you would like, I guess, some schooling as to, you know, what is this right-wing, left-wing thing, you know, political spectrum. So, you know, right-wing and left-wing politics comes from the French Parliament of the 1700s, 16th century, when right-wingers would sit on the right of the speaker, and they were more the conservatives. So they believed more in tradition. They believed that inequalities and disparities are a natural order. And you sort of see that reflecting and coming through strongly even today. It's still very much similar or the same, although there are different variants of it. And then those who sat on the left to the speaker were the liberals, and they wanted social change. So in a nutshell, basically, that's what it's all about. Yeah, what else did I want to talk about? Yeah, I think that's what I would like to respond to for now.
Okay, Danielle?
I have to applaud the amazing memory of my co-panelists, who seem to have remembered all the questions that were asked. I can't remember any of them. It's kind of like, do you remember that game when you're little where you have to like keep turning the cards over and then you have to match them? I think I've got possibly too much THC in my blood.
You need paper and a pen.
Yeah.
You need
so I did make some notes. I made some notes as I picked it up. I think the first one was about FNB. So obviously, I mean, it's a bad thing that FNB have, if it's true, been accused of these racist banking practices, but in a way it doesn't surprise me. I think it speaks to this whole thing that we see in South African society in general. Every now and then you hear these stories about how in Cape Town a black person tried to rent a cottage or something like that. And for instance, I've even heard of black people who will say that they got a white friend to phone in for them. And then when they phone in and they think it's a white person, then they're like, great, come and see us. But as soon as they find out it's a black person, it's a different story. So I think it would be a lie to suggest that that kind of racism, and it's a kind of racism which says that black people by default financially are not going to be capable, whereas white people by default will be. And it's, you know, I think that whether it was a decision of like, let's sit down one day and be racist towards black people on FNB's part, I doubt. It was probably more a case of just those hangovers from apartheid and that perception still coming through, which is very unfortunate. And I think, as a lot of people have pointed out, it's very unlikely that FNB are like on their own perpetrating racist banking practices. It's more likely to be something that happens to some extent across the board with all financial institutions, in my opinion. So that's that. You asked for the definition of left-wing and right-wing. And that made me think of something very important, I think, which is that it is not necessarily the case that if you are right-wing, you are racist. And I think that's an important distinction that we need to make. I think there are people out there, for instance, just because you're right-wing doesn't mean you're even white. I mean, there are plenty of right-wing people out there of different races. And in some cases, it's because you believe in something like private property rights, you believe that government should have a smaller role. You know, there's many things that being right-wing can mean, and not all of it has got to do with race. But sadly, the global right has become sort of indivisible from racism. And if I was a non-racist right-wing person, I would take strong exception to the way that the far right has harnessed race as an issue to a point that you can't think of right-wing today without thinking of racism being attached to it. I don't think that racism has to, by definition, be attached to the right, but I think it sadly has been. So I don't know if that's even connected to your question, but I thought it was like enough connected for me to say that. Because I think it's an important distinction. I mean, are we almost talking about the far right? It's you know, there are people, black people in South Africa who are considered to be on the right, and you know, it's a complicated thing of how do you treat someone like that? Can you completely dismiss their entire outlook? You know, I'm thinking of people like Gwen and Gwenya, who was DA's head of policy and who before was at the Institute for Race Relations, is someone who in many ways, you know, outlook might be seen as right wing. You know, and as a, you know, it's an interesting question. It's also that the other thing about racism, when you're talking about racism in Mayfair and stuff like that, is it's another interesting question is, you know, obviously the traditional wisdom among a lot of people in South Africa is that white people, black people can't be racist. So that's a whole other can of worms that you're opening up there. But I really note the concept of structural racism. And I understand the argument that black people can't be racist because of the structural system that has led to racism in the first place. However, I personally, and this is just an opinion, feel that there needs to be a distinction made between structural racism and individual racism. Because otherwise, how do you define what happens, for example, when I'm in my taxify on the way to work, and a black driver says something about colored people when we're driving through Westbury? You know, which is something that's happened to me. So if that's not racism, maybe you can say it's prejudice and it's not racism, but to me that's not helpful. So I personally believe there needs to be a distinction made, that the idea that racism is simply the idea of white people being racist to black people in South Africa today, I don't think that that holds water. And I've seen it in both ways. I've also had a colored person making disparaging comments about black people. So when that sort of thing happens, it makes you realize that it's a bit more complicated than that, in my personal opinion. It's a difficult one. Is white South Africa under threat? No. Thank you. But I don't know how really to expand on that. Do you know what I think? I think it's what it is that that's why it seems, if you're not white, it seems so weird for us to think that we're under threat, because from an outsider's perspective, it might seem like we've got so much, and we are still in a sort of situation, some would say economically, of power in South Africa after so long. And how can we turn around and say that we're threatened? But I think, in a way, it's almost this, and I can't understand it because I don't feel that way myself, but I think it's maybe a cultural form of threat, that you feel your culture isn't taken seriously enough, or that maybe it's that you're not relevant anymore like you used to be. I mean, I think white people enjoyed being, although they were the minority, they were more relevant government-wise during the apartheid years because of the sort of system of oppression that they put in place. So, and I think maybe that's what it's so hard for white people to get their hands to wrap their heads around nowadays, is just that they're not as relevant as they used to be, and that your culture is not disproportionately the predominant one on, say, TV, etc., etc. That's just a theory, who knows. But yeah, there was a question about the Israeli right, which was directed straight at me. It's, no one can deny the fact that the Netanyahu government in Israel has gone to new areas. It's gone further right than any government before, and obviously we've seen disturbing things now, which is that with the political situation in Israel being as it is, and you have got a new sort of centrist movement happening with Benny Gantz, Netanyahu has responded by going even further to the right and uniting with what in Israel is known as the Kahanist movement, which are basically Jewish supremacists. So I would be lying if I said that this doesn't exist and that it isn't disturbing. Obviously it is. to the credit of a lot of Jews globally is I feel like a lot of Jews globally have spoken out against this, and I think that Netanyahu, in his siding with Trump and in his siding with these far-right elements to form coalitions that he's doing now, has pushed a lot of Jews worldwide into no longer finding his politics acceptable. And to me, that's a good thing. And do I hope that the centrist guys, Gantz, come to power as opposed to Netanyahu? Yes, I do. Sadly, in my personal opinion, whether it's going to make a difference to whether there's going to be a Palestinian state or not, you know, I mean, sadly, I've seen Gantz's platform, and it's not nearly it's not nearly as conducive to peace as I personally would have liked, which is also sad. Yeah, there's also the issue of the fact that you know, the right wing, it's complicated. You have got Jews in South Africa, like for instance, the Jewish Board of Deputies, to their credit, really came to my defense when I was targeted with anti-Semitism after being doxxed by the alt-right. But on the other hand, I did have a handful of Jewish people siding with the guy who made the video about me, and the idea that there's no Jewish people on the right is you know, not, and I think globally you're seeing that. I mean, Modi, the current is it Prime Minister or President of India? Prime Minister is hugely right wing, and you've got you know, the Brazilian President Bolsonaro and stuff like that. So you're seeing this move towards sort of right wing populism, which sadly has seen Israel moving further right as well. And you know, there's this sort of basket of guys like Trump and Netanyahu and Bolsonaro and Modi, who all kind of seem to be friends, sadly. And yeah, do I think it's a good thing? Certainly I do not. I must say, I personally don't understand Jewish people who would side with people who share anti-Semitic memes and who seem to, you know, make Holocaust jokes in response to, you know, I don't understand it. But and I can't say that I've got all the answers. But yeah, I guess this is simply an opinion. I would hope that Gantz and the more centrist government in Israel comes to power. It looks like that might happen. I definitely don't think that would be a negative thing, but sadly, I don't necessarily think that it would be the seismic shift that we would need in order for there to be a lasting peace.
Yeah, thank you very much, Danielle. Just to close, for a vote of thanks, I'm going to call on Angelo Fig, who works for ASRI, which is the Auwal Socio-Economic Research Institute, and I'm sure you also know him more as a commentator, as an analyst also. And yeah, and as is coming up here, just for 1 minute, to allow Dombovuyo to say that one.
Yeah, I just want to say one thing, if the House will allow me. So Kenny, you actually asked, you know, relating to the F&B situation, and you were saying that a lot of black people should be angry, and I thought about that, and I think going home here today, we should ask ourselves, what should we do with our rage? You know, what do we do when we're angry and frustrated and agitated? How do we deal with conflict in a way that is constructive and peaceful at the same time? I think that will be very useful when it comes to sustaining peace the world over. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dombovuyo. Okay. So Angela is here. Just before, let me just thank Mankwasa for the venue and the support they've given us for today's event. It's very important. But let me give it to Fig.
So I'm under effect from ASRI, and I'm here to just thank the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation for hosting this dialogue. We are in partnership with them on events like this. We had one which was mentioned by the CEO before, which was the launch of the IJR's barometer upstairs in the same venue, which is now about 6 months ago. Of course, tomorrow is, in some senses, Human Rights Day, and for those of us who are grey-haired and old enough, it will always be Sharpeville Day, as well as Human Rights Day. And this falls in the middle of Anti-Racism Week, where there will be several events, not just in South Africa, but around the world, focused on really combating racism. And anti-racism, I think, is a very crucial idea to hold on to. In thanking everybody for attending, I'd like to close with the remarks of two people from the 20th century, one of whom is still alive with us in the 21st. Angela Davis, in 2013, at a talk at the University of California, Davis, which was about racism and its re-articulation in post-millennial context, said, "Over the last few decades, we have had to unlearn racism, and not only white people. We have had to unlearn the assumption that racism is individual, and primarily a question of individual attitudes to be dealt with through sensitivity training." And I think it's important for us to recognize that it isn't just about changing people's minds. That isn't enough. In anti-racist work, it's also about changing structures and institutions that allow people to have such ideas and such thoughts and such beliefs, and to act on such ideas and thoughts and beliefs. Because these people are not just acting out of some sort of individual paranoia or some sort of individual psychosis only. They're also doing so because it is possible to do so. Questions have to be asked about whether or not state intelligence services that can track left-wing organizers, why they're not able to track right-wing organizers. During the World Cup in Germany, German intelligence officials could track very well all the right-wing movements, who were using the new technologies in order to organize those fights that they were having, not in the streets where the police were patrolling, but in forests outside of the cities, beyond the stadiums. So this idea that a South African state, a New Zealand state, an Australian state, the giant edifice that is Interpol, the CIA, cannot track people is simply incredulous. There's a standard joke. If you can find me with my mobile phone, why can't you find a plane that disappeared? The same question has to be asked. If you know what I said in a meeting with somebody, and you can joke about it at a press conference, why can you not tell me who these racists are? And then I'd like to quote Martin Niemöller, who was a Protestant minister during the 1930s and 40s in Germany during its Nazi years, who said in a poem that is often quoted, "First they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out, because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out, because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me." We cannot afford to be that person who wants somebody else to speak for us while we have spoken for no one else. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have come to the end of our seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I feel like we should sing a song or something.
Yeah, like keep smiling.
You have inspired me. I'm going to read my father's book.
I love it. Floral revolution.
It's a happy meeting.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. I was actually my t-shirt I was going to wear as well.
Mandla tells me he knows my dad. He says,
I'm not too sure. have to think through what it means to book.
I feel so bad. I haven't read it.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes. Amazing. Thank you so much.
So you were the one who hasn't read your dad's book.
Yeah, I haven't read either of his books.
You were supposed to be here. Oh, is that why you're worried about?
Oh, you
terrible.
You
were Talani the whole time.
Okay, so I didn't sure.
Known as a needless concierge.
Ah, beautiful.
Oh, yeah, I want to do this.
What about Daniel? Yeah, you too.
We're leaving him out.
Oh, I'm glad you connected. Yeah. I feel like
we're excluding him.
Oh, sure.
I'm signless.
We just do waist up, please.
Co-sign.
No knees, please.
No knees. The knees are put already.